Thank you very, very much, David. So next couple of years are going to be challenging, and with a population more polarized maybe than ever before. So what are the best avenues, do you think, to kind of get your message out? Do more of the same, of course, but specifically, what do you think?
I mean, I think that one of the best things we can do is just electing better people that actually give a damn and aren't owned by corporations. That's why I'm doing this work at Leaders We Deserve, to show young people in these state legislatures and at least with people in Congress that while it feels like things are so broken and things are so corrupt, that not all hope is lost, because at least there's one person like Justin Jones in Tennessee, for example, that's there fighting for you, that's helping to create change, and that your voice has not been completely drowned out by special interests like the NRA and so many others that seek to take our country even further away from what the majority of us want. And I think with that too, working to help get more great young people elected in these state legislatures, but at the same time, doing more work to figure out how to address our incredibly corrupt judicial system as well, and the fact that it has been taken over by a massive conspiracy called the Federalist Society. That is the single greatest threat to American democracy of any organization I've ever seen in modern American history. And if there were historians writing about what caused the fall of the United States, one of the main chapters would be about the Federalist Society. And the fact that we also have a blatantly corrupt justice on the Supreme Court right now, like Clarence Thomas, who has taken millions of dollars in bribes and is allowed to continue being a sitting justice on the Supreme Court, while his wife is also texting the White House Chief of Staff on January 6th about what is going on. It's a disgusting perversion of the court's responsibility to be impartial and be a fair place for cases to be heard in the first place, and how much they've also gone against the actual history of judicial precedent, especially around the Second Amendment, and effectively how they recreated the Second Amendment with DC versus Heller.
Here's one question. How do you start conversations with people who would rather stay quiet?
Well, I think that it's honestly the most important. The great thing is you can stay quiet and still do the most powerful thing you can, which is vote. Even if somebody is not joining you in a rally, even if somebody is not speaking super overtly about this, even if they don't want to really make their voice heard, the most important way you make your voice heard is by voting, period. So that's what I would say. You don't need to convince them to join you in a rally, to organize with you or anything like that. You just need them to get out there and vote every single election that they can, and remind them that there is an election, and make sure that they actually turn in their ballot too.
How are teachers around the country participating in gun violence prevention? Are they fighting for legislation about gun safety?
Well, a lot of them are running, thankfully. A lot of them are running. For example, there was a young man named Oscar de los Santos that we supported, and it's kind of funny. When I called him up to let him know that we were endorsing him, he's in Arizona. He was a teacher for a couple of years. When I called him up to let him know that we were endorsing him, he said, "Sorry, I can't talk right now. I'm repealing the abortion ban from 1864. A lot of them are running. We're actually about to elect the youngest person in Georgia state history, who was a 7th grade algebra teacher. He's 22 years old. And what happened is he had a student that apparently had witnessed his father get shot and killed the night before. And the student was in class the next day. And when he asked this student, like, "How are you doing?" the student said, "Oh, it's okay. This happens every day." Because that's how normalized it is in his community in Atlanta. And he decided that he had to run, and he ended up defeating somebody that had previously flipped parties, and he's going to be the youngest person ever elected to the Georgia State Legislature and the first ever active public school teacher as well. So that's how a lot of them are getting involved. A surprising number of our candidates have been teachers, actually. So a lot of them are running, but the other thing that you can do too is make sure that your schools are using the resources allocated, that your states are using the resources allocated in the Safer Communities Act to help fund more mental health programs, counselors, and other people like that. And also making sure that you get your students registered to vote and helping them, especially ones with special needs like myself, who is dyslexic and has ADD as well, to help them believe in themselves even when they don't believe in themselves. I would not be here without my debate teachers, for sure, or my teachers in 3rd grade that helped teach me how to read, for example. So being the best teacher you can is probably the best thing you can do. We also need to get you guys paid way more, but that's a story for another time.
That's another story. Okay. Comment on other politicians that take no corporate or lobbying campaign funds and weave in AOC and her support for your organization.
So here's the interesting thing that a lot of politicians do a lot of the time. So AOC, she's her own badass and has many other things going on than focusing on state legislatures, which is what Leaders We Deserve mainly does. What's really interesting is the loopholes that I've learned about that politicians use to say that they don't take corporate money, but then eventually do take it. So there are these things called leadership PACs that are PACs that members of Congress set up where a politician might say, hey, I'm running for office, I'm not taking corporate money. Corporations almost never give money to candidates that are running for the first time. They give it to incumbents so that those incumbents can then use that to fund their campaigns after they've already been elected and have that advantage. And then they also, even if they aren't taking corporate money, a lot of them end up raising that money into their leadership PAC, which is not to fund their campaign, but is to help give that money to other campaigns to exert their influence, to say like, hey, I helped you, give you $5,000 or whatever it is when you were running, so I need your help now to do X, Y, or Z thing. And that money is coming from corporations a lot of the time. So there's all kinds of unique bullshit loopholes that I'm sure you guys can imagine that they use to help take that. But with Leaders We Deserve, we make sure that our candidates know that we know about those loopholes too, and if they violate them, that they will be primaried and defeated as well. Because we have a big carrot, but we also have a big stick.
What are 3 laws that you'd like to see legislature pass, if possible, in this coming legislative?
In California? Yeah. Okay. 3 laws. First one that comes to mind is actually CEQA reform. Super boring bureaucratic word. CEQA is California's equivalent of the Environmental Protection Act on steroids. It has made it much harder to build housing in this state, and I support environmentalism, but this law has actually made it much harder to build the most environmentally friendly housing, which is high-density, transit-oriented development where you don't need to own a car to live. And it's because whenever there's a development that happens, the developer gets sued under CEQA saying, oh my God, there's this endangered beetle that lives there, or whatever it might be, there's something. And they always use that to prevent the building of more affordable housing. And that's actually, California's housing crisis is partially what forced my family to move to Parkland in the first place. My dad got early onset Parkinson's disease. He was an FBI agent. We couldn't afford necessarily, if you had to medically retire, we were not gonna be able to afford our mortgage. So we had to move somewhere that we could afford to Parkland, Florida, which was the safest community that we could find, only for me to go through the shooting with my sister. So in some ways you could say that California's housing crisis helped result in me being at that shooting, unfortunately. So we need to do a lot more work to protect the environment while simultaneously building more housing, because the cost of living in this state is absolutely insane. So I think CEQA reform is really important. And then I also think that, there's always new innovative things we can do around guns that we should be working on. One of the laws that I was happy to see them pass a few years ago that I was lobbying for was a 10% tax on all firearm sales and paraphernalia, specifically earmarked to fund programs that are aimed at reducing gun violence. And it was great to see the legislature pass that after it had died multiple times in the legislature in previous sessions. One of the other laws that we passed with the California State Legislature a few years ago is something that actually impacts all the students that are here, which is the California Youth Civic Voter and Engagement and Empowerment Act, or some ridiculous title like that. And what it did is it required college campuses to have all college campuses in California that get public funding to have polling places on their campuses and do voter registration drives and have paid people that tell students there's an election. And that helped to massively increase youth voter turnout in this state. So honestly, I need to get back to you on what other things the state legislature could do here. Certainly there's plenty of them. But in general, I would say in California, we need to get a lot better at governing. I don't know if you guys heard the story about the $1.6 million toilet that they had to build it was like San Mateo or something, that took like 7 years and $1.7 million to build one toilet, but that is insane. We need to make it easier to build stuff in this state, way easier.
Maybe a question about dealing with partisan divides. How do we also hold Democrats accountable? Too many older Democratic voters get mad at young people when we do. That is, young people try to hold them accountable and turn off the Democrats who are maybe marginally better than Republicans.
I mean, honestly, this is a controversial opinion, but I have no problem with primarying people in safe seats at all. I think our party needs to be constantly focused on getting better, and a lot of these people get too comfortable in their positions where they're able to just sit around and do nothing for 30 years. I also think that we should have younger people that are running for these open seats as well, because there's a lot of, I don't know how many of you, many of you lived through the ending of the Soviet Union, but those of you that didn't, there was basically a huge, they had a bunch of people that had stuck around for so long that waited to become the head of the Soviet Union, that one of them died one after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, and it helped to collapse the Soviet Union along with what we did in Afghanistan with them. But what's crazy about that is like, it really weakened their country because those older people waited so long to come into power like that. And we're actually about to deal with something that's not as dramatic, but is nonetheless kind of similar, where baby boomers have held on to power for so long that we are dealing with one of the oldest Congresses ever in American history. And I love old people, don't get me wrong. I totally love old people. I would not be here without them. But we need, if we had a proportional number of 25 to like 45-year-old people in the US Congress to what it is population-wise, does anybody want to take a guess of how many members of Congress we'd have that are under 45?
10.
Way more. It's more than 10. It's something insane like 108. Right now, I think it's like 12 that we have, or some crazy number like that. Either way, it is absurdly low, and we need to elect more young people because we know some of the best people that we've ever had as president, for example. FDR, when he was first elected to the New York State Senate, I think he was 29 when he was first elected. LBJ was 28. Abraham Lincoln, when he was first elected, was 25 to the Illinois State House of Representatives. And Biden, I know this is shocking, was 29 when he was first elected to the Senate. It makes sense. And LBJ was 28 when he was first elected to Congress. If you start when you're young, you gain a lot of experience and know how to get things done. But I think that we need it. It's more expensive than ever to run for office, and we need to help those young people run for office, which is why Leaders We Deserve exists. But we need an intergenerational coalition too. I don't want to just have all 25-year-olds in Congress. We need a diversity of age in our legislatures so that they're able to share the institutional knowledge.
Along this line is the question, do you think that Congress should have term limits?
I think the answer to this is yes, but with some caveats. The fact that we'll have a system where people and public servants, for example, generals from the US military, are allowed to go from working at the DoD and then go work at Raytheon, for example, on their board, and then go back and be the Secretary of Defense is absurd. And I don't want to recreate that with members of Congress, which would be another revolving door that we have in DC. I have a bit of a controversial opinion, potentially. It's not really a partisan controversial opinion, but it's not necessarily very popular. I think we need to pay congressmen way more. I think we need to pay them like $500,000 a year. And basically say, you're going to get paid $500,000 a year, you're going to get a pension, you cannot work in any lobbying job ever, or anything even remotely related to that after you are in Congress. We will make you rich, but you cannot be corrupt. And if you do, we will indict your ass and you will go to prison. I know that's a controversial opinion, but the other thing is too, we also need to pay our state legislators more. So for example, in Texas, do you know how much you're paid to be a state legislator? For context, you have to take 6 months off every 2 years to be a legislator in Texas, a state with a GDP bigger than most countries in Europe. You get paid $7,000 a year to be a legislator in Texas. So what happens a lot of the time, and this is really crazy, is in Texas, there's a lot of lawyers that run to be state legislators so that they can they can say to the judge like, oh my God, I have to go back to the legislature, so like we need to settle this case right now or else it's just going to continue on, so then they can get more cases done, make more money. And then if those judges say, well, no, you need to be here, guess who controls the judges' pay? The legislators, right? It's a very corrupt system, and we need to pay people a living wage to be in these offices of power because, frankly, I think it's like $189,000 that members of Congress are paid right now. That sounds like a lot, but you got to remember they're traveling constantly, and they're also, they have to have housing in 2 states at the same time. That's crazy. So we need to pay them a hell of a lot more, in my opinion, and have much stricter laws around corruption and what jobs they can have after they're in Congress, along with term limits. But if we don't have those things in place, term limits could become a very bad thing, potentially.
There's another question about dark money. How do we keep it out of politics?
And Citizens United, and reform the Supreme Court. Because what they mean by that, just for context, I'm trying to give you guys some of the inside baseball of how this works. So if you give money to a super PAC, it's publicly disclosed. But if you give money to something called a 501c4, that money is not disclosed, and up to 49% of that money, the explicit purpose of that organization is not to be political, but under some of the decisions that the Supreme Court made, they said, all right, you can give up to 49% of that money to a super PAC that runs an independent expenditure that is parallel to a campaign, but is not officially coordinated with the campaign, which is also kind of bullshit. They're able to do that, and the donors to that 501c4 are not publicly disclosed. So that's how a lot of that dark money gets in the first place. So that's a huge problem that we need to reform. And luckily, because we have so many donors to Leaders We Deserve, you can see on the FEC pretty much all 125,000 of our donors that are out there, if you want.
Okay, how do we get more integrity in the Supreme Court?
Basically, get an FDR elected to be president and say, get your shit together or we're going to set age limits on the Supreme Court. And realize that this is a system of checks and balances. And the judicial branch is getting out of control right now and going against hundreds of years of precedent and severely hurting, like we don't realize it, but that the Chevron decision that was made is going to kill probably millions of people over the next 30 years. Because it's, right now, for example, there's a case that's being heard by a judge in California on one of, I think it's the Federal Circuit Court here. And in that case, because of the ending of Chevron deference, that makes it so that it's a case specifically around whether or not a community can fluorinate their water to prevent cavities, right? In that case, though, that judge is not allowed to hear anything that the EPA wants to say about fluorination because of the ending of Chevron deference, anything positive that the EPA wants to say. They're just supposed to hear from those special interest groups that say, oh my God, it's making people dumber, even though that's been largely discredited. And it is a real problem because we're stripping these government agencies from having the ability to really enforce a lot of these laws unless they go through a judge who oftentimes doesn't know what the hell they're talking about, that doesn't have expertise in that area. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't want a judge making the same judge that's making decisions over who can have which guns to also be the one that's deciding whether or not forever chemicals are allowed in our water, right? It's impossible for them to be a biologist, a constitutional law scholar, all these things that people study decades to be just one of, but to be all of them at the same time. And the ending of Chevron deference is pretty disastrous, but I think we also need to have a real conversation around term limits on the Supreme Court and potentially expanding the court as well. And also ending judge shopping, which is I'm not at a law school, so I won't go on about that right now, but it's a big problem.
Okay. Well, let me just ask a question of my own then. So what you're calling for is really a pretty radical overhaul of the way things are done right now. Mm-hmm. So where do you go, step by step to get there? Because it's not going to happen in the next 6 months.
Well, first, we basically reverse engineer the conservative playbook that got us here, which is helping to take over these state legislatures and get these young people elected there now that are going to outlive a lot of these people that are in those state legislatures. And then using those state legislatures to figure out what we can get through the courts right now and build up the jurisprudence around it. And then once the Supreme Court, members of the Supreme Court move on because they die of old age, we help to say, actually, this is why DC versus Heller is unconstitutional. This is why Usurpa v. Bruin is unconstitutional. This is actually why Chevron deference is a good thing, and why Citizens United is wrong. So we're trying to lay the groundwork for that right now, but it's a long game that we're playing that will take decades to see the results of.
So it's your generation playing the long game.
Pretty much, yeah.
Question here is asked, how can students get involved? Give them some concrete advice.
Show up. And what I mean by that is whatever you're passionate about. Of course, like I said, you can come up to me if you're interested in anything that I'm doing and how to help with it. But really what I need you to do that would be more helpful than anything is take the agency yourself to help make this a better community. Whether that's on campus, whether that is in the city. You know how few young people show up at a city council meeting? Or a school board meeting typically? It's very few. And these politicians, I know that they seem intimidating and like they're gonna stop anything from happening, but a lot of the time, they have so many issues that they have to focus on that they basically default to who is the biggest threat to my power right now. And if you become one of those threats, they're gonna listen to you, especially if you're registering tons of young people to vote and you run somebody to challenge them. Even if you run a candidate against a school board member or city council member or member of Congress or something else that isn't going to win and has a snowball's chance in hell at winning, you can generate a lot of negative press for them that costs you $0. That can have a very strong effect on changing their behavior because they respond basically to what threatens their power the most. And if you become one of those threats, hopefully it's for a good cause, obviously, they change typically or they get voted out. And you have your vote, and that's what you got to use. So that's one thing I would say, and then you can come up to me if you're interested in doing more work with me in particular. But you got to find what you're passionate about and just get to work on it. And I think a good example of this too is recently in DC, like I moved into a new neighborhood, and when I first moved in, there was trash everywhere in my neighborhood. PACs pay excellently for the cost of living in DC, but I went and started just picking up the trash around my neighborhood. And then I saw on one of the bus stops there was blood on the sidewalk that had been left on there for weeks because the city hadn't cleaned it up. So what I did is I went and got a power washer and just did it myself and took it off with 1,600 pounds of pressure. Power washers are pretty fun. But I'm just slowly becoming my dad. That's what's happening. As I was doing that though, all of a sudden my neighbors started coming out and helping me, and then all of a sudden the entire neighborhood was clean. But that's just because I took the initiative myself to do it, and that's what so many people are waiting for somebody else to do a lot of the time. Even if you feel like you're alone and that nobody's gonna support you, half the time if you just get out there and start doing it and are really in it for the right reasons and continue at it, people will show up and support you because they're looking for somebody to lead them. So just be that leader. It's a weird metaphor, but I think you get it.
What are the most difficult, discouraging situations you faced when you're been doing your organizing, and how did you overcome it? To give some inspiration to those of us who are discouraged.
Yeah. I guess one story that comes to mind that actually involves UCSD is that when I was in college, or when I was in high school and I was applying to schools, I applied to UCSD and a couple other UCs, and I got rejected from almost all of them, including this one, ironically. And when I was 17 and I was upset about it, so I posted about it online and how sad I was and everything. And foolishly, I talked about my SAT score and I talked about my GPA and other stuff like that. And Laura Ingraham, less than 2 months after this shooting happened, decided to make an hour-long segment or something like that about how I was just so ungrateful and all this other stuff, and I was just, a crybaby liberal, whatever. And, she made that, and it was just crazy because I was 17 years old, She's like a grown-ass woman, like making this show. So what I did, obviously that was discouraging and wow, upsetting. But what I did with my sister, this is one of the things I'm most proud of because I just laughed so much about it, was I got a list of all of Laura Ingraham's sponsors, because you know how these people on Fox News love the free market so much and free speech. And I tweeted out that list of sponsors. And Laura Ingraham ended up getting forced off the air it was over like 2 weeks for personal reasons, conveniently afterwards, and had to make an on-air apology to me. And that helped me stay really encouraged. And then the other thing is like realizing that joy is part of creating change, and it has to be. One of the most discouraging parts about this too was after the shooting, so many people said to us, they would take photos of us that were taken where a TV producer, for example, would say, "Oh my God, you kids are so inspiring. Can I take a photo with you?" What do you do in a photo? Even after you've gone through something terrible, like you smile, right? Naturally, it's just instinctual. And we did that, of course. And people would make memes about us that said, "This is the face that you make when you're standing on the bodies of your dead classmates." And it really affected us for so long. And we didn't feel like we could smile because of what had happened to us and what all those people had said. And I realize now the reason they said that is because they knew that in order for us to fail, that they had to take the one thing from us that could make it possible for us to succeed, which was any amount of joy. Because this work is really hard. And the hardest part for me to learn was how to unlearn that. And part of how I did it is, for example, after Uvalde, the parents from Uvalde that had lost children had asked me and other classmates of mine from Parkland to go out and visit them. And that day we went and met with them. It was a very emotional day, exhausting. It was 110 degrees, and they decided to do a march around the city demanding accountability from their awful police department that did nothing after the shooting. Every time they tell you that police are the answer to this, I want you to remember that there were 100+ police officers outside of the Uvalde school that did nothing. Same thing happened in Parkland. And guess what? I think there's no better point of evidence for this than the fact that a 20-year-old nearly assassinated Donald Trump despite having Secret Service protection, right? I think it's time that we stop spending billions of dollars more on police and start addressing the guns. But as we were marching around protesting and everything, we go back to our hotel, and usually what I would have done after this is I would have just stayed at the hotel. We would have, my colleagues, activists, others, would have just gone back to our hotel rooms and stared at the ceiling and been sad for the rest of the night. But what I said to them after doing this march around the city and everything, I said, "All right, guys, today was obviously really taxing, really exhausting, but what we should do is we need to go like 30 minutes outside of town and go stargazing, because Uvalde is in the middle of the desert in South Texas, in the middle of nowhere." So we did that. And we went out there and just stared at the stars and talked about literally anything except gun violence that day. And my past self used to think that was so dumb to do. Like, it's so irrelevant, it's not important, it's not about the cause, But what I realized is that's one of the most important things to do, because if you're only around your organizers or other activists after there's been a mass shooting, after there's been an instance of gun violence or something else that is just terrible that has happened, you are going to come to hate each other, because you're going to come to blame each other. And the hardest part, one of the hardest lessons to learn in activism and organizing is that you can do everything right and still fail. And what I've realized in the time since Parkland is that what's broken is not the movement to end gun violence or the survivors to end gun violence or the activists. What's broken is our government that is so irresponsive to the people's needs, right? And being able to build up that endurance by realizing that joy is inherently part of that resistance has been so essential in our success and in my own ability to continue doing this work. Because if I just cried every day about this and felt sad, I couldn't do it. I absolutely could not. So I've had to incorporate a lot of those things of having fun and seeing that as part of my resistance to those people, so that I can outlive them and eventually pass those laws with our great candidates. So, yeah.
Well, that inspires us, and to keep on living and to keep on fighting. So thank you very, very much.